In the temple horror of language, you note that your Indian relatives often ask, but why not Persian? What made Arabic feel like the language you wanted to master?
That's a really good question. I think it had, for some reason, just circumstances. I had just moved to New York right after 9/11. I had a kind of very intense introduction to the Palestinian cause, being a student at Columbia at that time. And I think Palestine was kind of the gateway for me, and ended up being why it was Arabic and not Persian or when I was just very lucky to have a couple of really good teachers in my second and third years there. I did also do Persian for a year while in grad school, and that was also, it was amazing. It was a lovely experience because my Arabic was quite good by then, and uh, having Urdu as a heritage language, I just remember everything in that I would hear or read during the class would kind of feel like it had some vague echo or it made sense, even if I didn't fully understand it.
There has been a strong push for decolonization in academia, but it still centers English as the default language of sorts. How can translation help break this pattern, especially in South-South exchanges?
That's a really good question. My fear is that decolonization can always become the victim of a kind of oppression Olympics identity politics that has to do with kind of the way the whole neoliberal system, the capitalist or neoliberal system, but that also translates to like in the academic and cultural world, kind of all plays us off against each other and makes us kind of compete with each other for the few crumbs, that are tossed to us by recognition. I think like, turf feminism is a great example of that, where, kind of the patriarchy and capitalism, white supremacy, all that kind of makes cis people and trans people like adversaries rather than allies to each other. Um, so, um, I mean, when it comes to South, I just, it's hard. One can't. English is the dominant sort of language of the world, and it's not like, I mean, it's not like as if you go to France or to Spain or somewhere where English is not that popular. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're decolonial. But I think when it comes to language teaching, language instruction, academia, and so on, I think one can just promote global South languages more because the majority of the world speaks, these languages, and it doesn't have to be Arabic necessarily. And it doesn't, I think the other thing also is, I think most people, non-white people in the humanities and academia end up studying themselves, quote unquote, in some way or the other. I think one can, I don't know exactly, how many. I think it's changing also, but I kind of feel like I tried to go against this trend and not just specialize in something South Asia related, but something by choosing to specialize in Arabic, I choose to like, in a sense, reopen those direct cultural and literary connections that were there before, English became necessary in order for those two regions to be able to communicate with each other. So I think there can just be, everybody, people in the humanities who are of, global South origins can think about looking or choosing to an area or a language or a culture that is not necessarily that of their parents. And I think that would be like a really nice sort of first step.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to get into Palestinian literature, resistance, and gatekeeping. And you've translated Raji Batisha's work, which
Mm-hmm.
explores queerness and exile. How did you first encounter his writing, and tell us a bit about him, and what drew you to translating him?
Sure. It's not simply that, because he's a queer writer and I'm queer and non-binary. It's not sort of that straightforward. I had originally, for my PhD, wanted to work on Palestinian writers from 48. So those who are so-called Palestinian citizens of Israel or the interior Palestinians. And before I started my PhD, I was in Haifa for 6 months doing an internship at a research center. And I was just trying to meet and find some of the writers who I had chanced upon, whose work I found interesting. And he was one of them. And he was the most responsive. And then while I was in grad school, I translated a couple of his stories. As like practice for a class, and then one of them was published, and then I ended up doing some more, and that's kind of, and so we developed like a close relationship since then, where I've worked on his stuff on and off. And he just has a piece that recently came out that I translated in on mahzin.org, which I'm happy to share with you about, which is a kind of reflection by him on what it means to be a Palestinian author in the sort of stage, like the kind of dystopic, like post-defeat stage of that Palestinians are kind of going through today.
And what I like about his work is that the manner in which he blurs poetry and prose. And can you tell a bit about that? A bit just about his style and what you found interesting while translating?
For me, I found the content of his work more interesting than the style, even though I think his style, his last two books have been more like novels without this kind of form, genre shifting, even though but the content is still like very is extremely radical, and it's all kind of, it's not, some people may say that he's depoliticizing, or he's not like talking about the occupation directly enough, but I think he's actually like humanizing Palestinians in a way that, and not refusing to let them be sort of just categorized into caricatures or boxes. And he's sort of, I think, challenging the Arabic language readers, many of whom have a sort of set perception of what it means to be Palestinian, and what life in Palestine is some kind of nonstop like left-wing action film. And I think he really challenges that, and he uses the queer angle as one of the sort of ins by which to do that. Although
Hmm.
his writings have never exclusively been only about queer characters.
Hmm.
But for him,
So,
I did an interview with him in 2016, where he says that Palestinians are a queer people because, they don't, their nation building project is not going to be realized, and they should embrace that rather than, uh, complain about it. And also because they don't have an army, they don't have any kind of father figure,
yeah,
that, especially since Yasser Arafat died, and for him, he says that, look at the Arab states around us, like they're all states, and look at what, how they are with their people, let's why don't we dream of something more queer than a state, and just want to be like everyone else. And that makes some people like very angry, but I think it's also a very fascinating thing. And it's not at
Yeah,
all a call by him to say, oh, stop struggling, stop resisting, and so on. But I think just the framework within which one does that, especially given the total disproportionate sort of ability with which to inflict violence that there is
mhm.
something very much is like super provocative and worth thinking about for me.
Yeah, Palestinian literature has historically been centered on like national identity, resistance, and exile, right? Like
Hmm.
Mahmoud Darwish or Ghassan Kanafani.
Hmm.
And Batish, as he adds a queer lens to these themes, like
Hmm.
his work around a room in Tel Aviv or the apartment in Passy Street,
Hmm.
challenges that political and literary norm. So you've kind of mentioned this, but how do you see his work fitting into or breaking from the tradition of Palestinian resistance literature
Well, I think
in
he's
that
not
way?
the only one for sure. There's a bunch of other writers, and some of them have started to come out now. There's Murid Barghouti. I saw Ramallah, who's a little bit. He's like he just died a couple of years ago. He was in his 70s. Which there's Hussein Barghouti, not related, who wrote this incredible sort of semi-fictional memoir called The Blue Light, which was just translated to English, which is
Hmm.
like this incredible sort of quasi Sufi kind of work about, he went to do his PhD in Seattle in the US during the first Intifada and got mixed up with all these like new age spiritual, and it caused a like an incredible kind of existential crisis for him. Anyway, I don't want to but there have been these other voices as well, so
Hmm.
he isn't the only one. He's maybe the first one to like really explicitly have the queer angle, but I think his project or his interest is broader than just being like the gay Palestinian writer.
Yeah, yeah, and much of Palestinian literature has been deeply tied to the question of exile, right?
Hmm.
And as someone who has lived between languages, do you feel a particular resonance with these themes?
I mean, yeah, in some sense, I feel like I've always been an outsider wherever I am. When I was very, very young, I didn't have this kind of, I didn't see myself as an outsider, but as I grew older, it was kind of the people around me that and their gaze that started looking at me as and that made me aware of my kind of, I don't know, questionable or unclear status. And so I've never really felt kind of like I belonged either to completely to either India or the United States. But I think when it coming back to Raji Bathish, I think obviously he writes fiction in different forms, but he writes about encounters between the Palestinians, living inside their homeland where they are a minority now. And they have to interact with the Israeli milieu around them. And those interactions are complex. They're not one-sided. They're not like of one nature only. They're always problematic, complicated, multidimensional. And I think again that for like the Arabic language reader that has a certain conception of what it is to live inside Palestine as opposed to it just being this cause, that it's kind of a little bit shocking and uncomfortable for them.